Over the last few months, an issue has been simmering in the background on PlayStation consoles. VRR is not working apparently. Well, we've done the investigation ourselves, and specifically Oliver McKenzie is joining me here, who's done a bulk of the work. So Oliver, what is this issue with VRR on PlayStation consoles?
Yes, Alex, this has been a persistent issue that we've been getting reports of for the last few months, I would say, since about December of last year. So basically, there is a persistent stuttering problem with VRR on PS5 and PS5 Pro as documented by users, and we've been able to replicate that behavior ourselves over the past few days. So basically, the first game I tested here is The Last of Us Part 2 on a Samsung QN90D. So that's a pretty decent mini LED panel. And I was actually able to replicate the issue pretty easily on PS5 Pro. So the key thing here is it doesn't usually emerge within the first 20 minutes of play. But with TLU Part 2 running at 120 Hz output with VRR in Pro mode unlocked, so with a variable frame rate there, the issue is very obvious. Now, if you look at my Last of Us Part 2 footage here, you should be able to spot a very slight stutter about every 8 seconds. And I've put a little timeline in the corner of the screen there, and every little blue marker that you see corresponds to a stutter. So hopefully you can anticipate those issues, and even over YouTube, you should hopefully be able to spot them because I think they're fairly obvious here. So it continues endlessly in this sort of periodic cycle where every 8 seconds or so, it just happens again and again and again. And it occurs curiously, like almost exactly every 8 seconds. Sometimes it's exactly 8 seconds. Sometimes it's like plus or minus maybe 10 or 15 frames or so at 60 FPS. So it can vary slightly. But those stutters are very often accompanied by a 120 Hz reading, which is the same you would get if a game fell out of the VRR range completely, or is using a technique like LFC to hit 120 Hz output there. But I don't think my Samsung is reporting the refresh rate of every single frame here, because sometimes it happens when there's a stutter, sometimes it doesn't, and it's clearly not varying enough that it's showing off every single frame time. It's kind of showing off maybe 1 in every 5 frame times there, I suspect, in that panel. So The Last of Us Part 2 is actually a really great game to test out a bunch of hypotheses I had about this problem, because if I booted the game up and let it run for about 20 minutes with VRR on, but without unlocking the frame rate, the game was fine. So it was totally fine. But when I had the game running unlocked and I had the issue emerge, and then I turned the FPS lock back on, it retained the stuttering behavior. So to see this issue, it looks like you really need to have that variable frame rate going on for some period there. And then after that point, you start to see the stuttering issue. I booted up Elden Ring next, very popular game, very unlocked game to our chagrin, to see if I could replicate the issue at 60 Hz output with VRR. And it seems like if a game doesn't have explicit VRR support necessarily, but does have a generally unstable frame rate here, you should be able to see the stutter. So here I was able to see the stutter, and hopefully you see that little timeline there. About every 8 seconds, I'm seeing that stutter again. But I would also say that with some of these games, you will be able to notice slight moment-to-moment frame time variance because of VR, because you are running with an unlocked frame rate with VR. You should be able to see a little bit of frame rate perturbations, but it's those kind of clear stutters, those clear, jagged, stark stutters that you should be able to notice in most titles, again, recurring about every 8 seconds. So I ended up testing a ton of games here, 19 games, which is very time consuming, as you can imagine, because you have to wait 20 minutes, 30 minutes before you actually start testing each one. So it took me quite a while. But these are the games that seem to suffer from the issue in my experience. So you have the Last of Us titles, Last of Us Part 2, Last of Us Part 1, Diablo 4, Hogwarts Legacy, Elden Ring, Resident Evil 4, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Marvel Spider-Man Remastered, Metaphor ReFantazio, and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. And these games, they stutter on PS5 as well in my testing, but I also did test briefly just to dispel any concerns or myths here. I did test out Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 on Series X, and it doesn't suffer from any stuttering issues. It runs perfectly fine with an unlocked frame rate in like the 60 to 80 FPS range, just like PS5, but without the stuttering problem. I also believe this issue, though I have not tested it out too much myself, that it should occur broadly across different panel types, different televisions, different monitors. We've personally tested it across different kinds of sets. I've tested it obviously on my QN90D, and it should occur on all kinds of different panels here. So Alex, what do you make of kind of those early excursions into this problem in those particular titles?
There's a lot to be said here. It occurs across such a breadth and variety of titles that it seems platform universal to a large degree. So it doesn't seem to be only limited to 120 hertz output necessarily. It also apparently only occurs after 20 to 30 odd minutes. And I did not run a timer to exactly see how long it takes. But usually when things creep in over a slow amount of period of time, I think about issues I've seen on PC before where there is some mismatch of refresh rates or a mismatch of an expected number over a period of time. There was a bug last year in the NVIDIA driver where VSync would be set, and over a period of, I think it was roughly 60 seconds, or so, VSync would degrade to like 59 to 58 FPS after about 60 seconds or so of play. Almost like it was expecting a different refresh rate that was slowly counting down or something over time. And I've also seen it in games before. With memory leaks, this is probably not a memory leak related issue, where over a certain amount of time you can start seeing performance degradations and things like that. Here, I mean, it is really hard to guess exactly what could be causing this. Something that one has to consider is that a console like the PlayStation 5 doesn't actually run at 120 hertz. It runs at NTSC 119.88 hertz. If there was some sort of different expectations between the set and the game console and the game, over a certain period of time, this rounding error could cause issues, but the numbers are strange. Exactly every 8 seconds, roughly, plus or minus a few frames. That is definitely not good. But your implication of having tested so many games, not all games are affected, right?
That's correct. That's correct. There are some games that don't have the stuttering behavior, which is another kind of wrinkle in this little mix that is a little bit confusing here. But this includes some games that do have unlocked frame rates. So in my testing, I tested out a bunch of games with unlocked frame rates, and God of War Ragnarok, Gran Turismo 7, Immortals of Avium, Dragon's Dogma 2 don't appear to exhibit this issue. I did test this pretty thoroughly in these titles, and in my testing they were fine. I thought some of the issues might be related to the game engine, but it's not totally clear that it is. Like in Dragon's Dogma 2, for instance, that title has no issues, right? And that's running on an RE engine. But Resident Evil 4 does appear to have issues. Now I have to provide certain caveats here, and I'll provide a number of caveats. Because these problems tend to emerge over time, I was usually testing with like 30 minutes or an hour or so of the game running, sometimes longer than that, but it's possible that some of these problems may emerge in these games over even longer periods that I didn't necessarily have time to test. So based on my sample here, I think the majority of prominent games, at least with unlocked frame rates, appear to have this issue, but I would reiterate that like one thing that you can be pretty sure won't cause an issue is if a game presents a pretty consistent frame rate output. So in a game like Alan Wake 2 or the recent Assassin's Creed Shadows, or really the majority of PS5 Pro and PS5 software, you should be getting a pretty consistent 60 FPS or 120 FPS or 40 FPS or 30 FPS or whatever, even with VRR enabled there. I don't think you'll have issues in those titles in general. Even if they have LFC or another technology to accommodate VRR, I don't think you'll generally have issues. If those titles are staying pretty much locked, in my experience, they shouldn't have issues. Now, again, I put caveat if you're playing for a longer period and maybe there are some frame rate wobbles. I don't really see anything that would preclude this issue happening. There's nothing like conceptually that separates a title that's like unlocked and locked with certain dips. So maybe that would introduce some timing issue over time. But I'd also provide the final caveat here. This issue is kind of hard to track down completely. And there were some games like Spider-Man 2, for instance, that had inconsistent enough frame times with VRR enabled. I think probably because of some CPU limitation or something like that, where it was hard to tell if the game had the issue or not, or if it was just its native kind of fundamental frame time instability, especially in the open world. In Spider-Man, you tend to notice some of those frame time inconsistencies, even with VRR enabled there. So it's just kind of hard to tell based on visual input in some games, but I'm fairly confident that on the order at least of 70%, maybe 80% of titles that I tested should have some of these issues in titles that do have unlocked frame rate modes. But Alex, I think you've also tested this issue, so could you explain, were you able to replicate this issue, and kind of what was your experience with this actual stuttering behavior?
Yeah, so I'm testing the game on LG Ultra Gear 32-inch dual mode OLED, 480, 240 hertz
Very
monitor,
nice.
4K 1080. It's a very sweet monitor. And I was running through HDMI 2.1. One thing I was making sure, and I think we should clarify, we are not letting the console sleep or anything like that and waking from sleep. This is just the game running. I played through the beginning of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Didn't happen in the initial area. Then I got to the second area after you kind of go picnicking with your friends by the lake. And then that's when I started noting it. It was roughly around 20, 25 minutes into the game, I believe. And at this point in time, just spinning the camera, the frame rate was around, I turned off motion blur on purpose, it was around 60 to 65 to 70 FPS, depending upon what I was looking at. But just while turning the camera, the frame time should be smooth. And they were smooth previously because I kept spinning the camera and over again. And then it started to creep in and it was really obvious. And I started being able to count with my breath, under my breath, 8 seconds out. And then would happen. Now, an interesting behavior that I recorded was that if that's me plugging into like HDMI 1 of my panel. If I switched back to HDMI 2, which was a PC, and I switched back to HDMI 1, the behavior would reset itself. It would go away. And then I'd keep spinning the camera, and then 20, 25 odd minutes later, it would start happening again. So that's a system level thing on the PlayStation 5 when it detects detects input and loses input. Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty sure input was being lost while the time I was switching over to a different input on my monitor, and then input is returned again when I bring it back online. And at that point in time, it would kind of like reset this timer, I would imagine, that is causing this issue. So it seems like changing the input on your television could potentially be a way to get rid of the issue momentarily, but it isn't very great because you're switching the input on your television, every couple of minutes. You can probably turn it on and off again. Maybe it would do the same thing. But for me, this is an OLED monitor. You have an LCD, yep. Right? Tom tested it also on a monitor. Yours is television. Mine is not a television. It seems broadly universal to anything that supports, the VRR standard, the HDMI VRR standard, at least. Obviously, one thing we did not check it out on was older FreeSync panels that potentially could have gotten support at some point by Sony, but I don't think that's something most people would be running these days anyway. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it's really bizarre. It definitely gets in the way of playability a whole bunch. It is less smooth presentation than VRR should be. It is a less smooth presentation than basic VSync. And if people don't know, it sounds like we're maybe nitpicking, but when you see a frame being held longer than it should be routinely every 8 seconds or so, it is extremely grating. It's like Mario Kart back in the day launched with the 59 FPS frame rate, and we were like, this is awful. This is not as bad as that, but this is still extremely distracting because that length of that frame time is actually pretty long. It is a shame that we don't have a very good way to measure VRR frame times, but it is actually pretty long. On my display, I don't have like one that measures the exact frame time or refresh rate every single refresh. Mine actually seems like a rolling average of the previous 120 or so. So in that aspect, I only would see just like a slightly lower frame rate in that one moment when I would say it. But that's the problem with averages. So they don't show you the in the moment actual fluidity of something. But in general, not very good. And if I were to just really quickly once again guess what is happening, maybe there are universal libraries provided by Sony to implement things like VRR and maybe even low frame rate compensation. Maybe not. But if there was something wrong with one of those tied to a system platform update, maybe that could have been causing this issue. But I guess the worst thing would be that it is actually something that was shipped with the game and then requires a game patch update. that is the situation you would potentially really not want to see, because it would then be completely up to the developer whether or not they can update these things. So hopefully, whatever the issue is, it's actually something system-wide that can be packaged together with the PS5 system update.
Yeah, I hope that's not the case, and especially I was testing some games that were of an older vintage and some games that were of a newer vintage, some games that had been patched like in the past week and other games that hadn't been patched since before the PS5 Pro came out. I was observing the same issue, so hopefully it's on the kind of system library side. Hopefully it's something they can update. But yeah, I would totally agree with Alex. I think this is a really big issue in affected titles. It's really bad, obtrusive, and obvious stuttering in my experience. And it kind of defeats the point of VRR. Like, the stutters are so noticeable and highly distracting, and that's the exact thing you're trying to avoid with VRR here. So if you are playing games on PS5 or PS5 Pro for extended periods, it could show up. And like Alex said, one way you can kind of avoid this issue is to switch inputs or restart the game or do something else to kind of reset that timer and give you an extra 20 minutes of stutter-free gameplay. Not ideal there. But no. Yeah, the only way to really avoid this issue completely is to disable VR and play your game without it. That's probably what I would do for a lot of games. So whatever issue is occurring here, Sony needs to fix it fairly urgently, I would say. A lot of people have VR panels these days. Probably a lot of people have VR enabled in their panels, enabled on the PS5, and even applying to the games that don't necessarily support VRR, right? Having that toggle on there as well. So it's going to kick in automatically. And in a lot of games, they have unlocked frame rate modes that will kick in without any user input, right? So in a title like The Last of Us Part 1 or Part 2, many other titles, the Uncharted games, you'll get a little toggle, right? And that's a great way to, give yourself an unlocked frame rate experience with a little bit more inconsistency, or a locked frame rate experience that might, give you some VR benefit if it's dipping there. But in a title like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 or Diablo 4, those are games that if you have a VR panel connected and you have VR enabled, you're going to get an unlocked frame rate experience on PS5 or PS5 Pro there. So that's not ideal, because you're going to get a substandard experience kind of no matter what you do, unless you turn VR off. That's the only solution there. So yeah, ultimately, I would say this is a big issue. In my own personal testing, at DF, we mostly test with VSync on, obviously, because of capture limitations and because we want to show you guys a good presentation for the game, a good frame presentation for the game. And when I was testing VR, I wasn't leaving on for really extended periods there. When I do play with VRR, I tend to play games without the unlocked toggles on, because I tend to just prefer a locked lower refresh to an unlocked higher one, unless the unlocked higher one is a lot higher. But this is for sure a big issue for gamers who are playing unlocked frame rate games, or in general who are playing games on PS5 or PS5 Pro. Like, you need to be aware of this, and you probably need to, in a lot of cases, avoid VRR until Sony patches this issue. Hopefully they can patch this issue at some point in the near future. But I think that probably wraps it up for us, unless you had anything else to say, Alex.
No, it's definitely not a good situation. And let's see, maybe there's some traction on the Sony side of things, or maybe even some developer response to see if they're also seeing this too. That always helps. But until then, I guess that's the end of this video. So Oliver, thank you for doing the bulk of the workload here. We're very grateful.
Yeah, no problem, Alex. It was so fun as always.
And if you did like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, help us out on Patreon, follow on social media. And as always, this is Alex and Oliver saying
Auf Wiedersehen.